The sterile, fluorescent lights of the Los Angeles Superior Court hummed with a low, oppressive frequency. The air inside felt heavy, thick with the scent of polished wood, anxiety, and the overpowering, cloying scent of cheap cologne radiating from the defense table. Sitting exactly 20 feet away from me was Chloe. She was wearing a violently magenta-tailored suit, an aggressive, loud color choice consciously selected to project dominance and mask her underlying panic. She leaned into her high-priced, heavily compensated attorney, whispering something behind a manicured hand while gesturing vaguely in my direction. I did not need to read her lips to know exactly what she was saying. A distinct smirk played on her lips, that familiar, condescending upward tilt of her mouth that she exclusively reserved for people she considered entirely beneath her. She thought she had won. She firmly believed that I was just the mousy, introverted lab tech in a thrift store cardigan who had finally been crushed under the sharp heel of her stilettos. I didn't flinch. My breathing remained steady, my heart rate completely unchanged. I didn't cry or break down as she expected me to. Instead, I simply looked down at my phone resting on the plaintiff's table. My screen was open to a highly secure, encrypted corporate messaging application. My thumb hovered over the digital keyboard for a fraction of a second, feeling the immense weight of the moment before I typed a single, definitive directive to the chief operating officer of my holding company: freeze the supply lines. All of them, effective immediately. I hit send. The screen locked. The invisible trap I had spent months meticulously building had finally snapped shut. Before I tell you exactly how I mathematically dismantled her entire fraudulent life, exposed her hollow empire to the world, and left her sobbing in this very courtroom with absolutely nothing to her name, I want to know who is listening to this right now. Drop a comment below and let me know what city or state you're tuning in from. Hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe to the channel for more satisfying stories. And let's rewind the clock to where this absolute nightmare of a partnership began. To fully understand the catastrophic gravity of Chloe's mistake, you must first understand who I actually am. To the ruthless, hyper-competitive world of Los Angeles beauty startups, my name is Naomi. I am a cosmetic chemist. I purposely wear oversized, neutral-toned cashmere sweaters completely devoid of recognizable logos. I drive a reliable, meticulously maintained 6-year-old sedan, and I spend 80% of my waking hours locked away in a sterile, temperature-controlled laboratory. I spend my days obsessing over molecular structures, lipid barriers, and the exact enzymatic extraction processes of rare biopeptides. I intentionally present myself as a worker bee, quiet, compliant, easily replaceable, but that image is merely a carefully curated, heavily engineered shell. The absolute truth, buried securely beneath layers of ironclad non-disclosure agreements, offshore trusts, and anonymous corporate entities, is that I am the silent, sole heir and primary shareholder of a global supply chain conglomerate. My family's invisible empire doesn't just manufacture beauty products. We own the raw materials that build the entire global industry. We own the sustainable farms in Madagascar that harvest the premium vanilla. We own the advanced processing facilities in South Korea that refine the active botanical extracts. We control the deep, invisible rivers of global commerce that feed every major cosmetics brand on the shelf. But true, generational power is silent. It doesn't need a billboard. It doesn't need validation. And then, there was Chloe. We crossed paths exactly 2 years ago at an exclusive biotech and angel investor networking mixer in downtown Los Angeles. The economic climate in the United States was, and still is, suffocating for the average, hard-working person. Inflation was actively squeezing the middle class. Basic groceries cost a fortune. Housing markets were incredibly volatile, and people were terrified of losing their financial footing. Yet operating right in the middle of this widespread, palpable societal anxiety, Chloe moved as if she were completely immune to the basic laws of mathematics and money. She walked into that mixer radiating an aura of chaotic, unearned wealth. She was draped in aggressive luxury, a heavily monogrammed designer tote bag that screamed for attention, diamond studs that caught entirely too much light, and a leased, top-of-the-line luxury European SUV, parked right by the valet entrance. She aggressively introduced herself to everyone as a visionary brand architect. She was loud, charismatic, and devastatingly charming to those she calculated could elevate her status. Through the industry grapevine, she had discovered that I had formulated a revolutionary, highly active botanical hair regrowth compound. It wasn't just another diluted snake oil serum, it was a clinically viable, cellular-level breakthrough that effectively stimulated dormant follicles, a formula I had been quietly perfecting in my independent lab for 3 years. Chloe cornered me by the catering table. She was relentless, painting a magnificent, glittering masterpiece of our potential future. She promised she would handle the grueling front end of the business, the aggressive marketing campaigns, the brutal venture capital pitches, the superficial influencer outreach, and the aesthetic packaging design. I would be left completely alone to do what I loved most, the pure science. On paper, it sounded like the perfect, highly efficient symbiosis. I agreed to a partnership, willingly handing her the reins to be the brand's public, glittering face. However, I quietly retained the intellectual property rights to the core formula under a separate, anonymous holding company, a minor, deeply buried legal clause I insisted upon, which she gleefully signed without ever having a competent corporate lawyer review the fine print. She was far too eager for the impending spotlight to care about the shadows I was operating within. For the first year, things seemed to move smoothly as we developed the prototype, but as the official launch date for our flagship product rapidly approached, the severe structural cracks in her shiny facade began to splinter. I started to notice the meticulous, cruel ways she tried to establish a psychological hierarchy between us. It wasn't outright, explosive hostility at first. It was the subtle, insidious poison of daily microaggressions. When we held critical meetings with potential retail distributors, she would introduce me, not as her equal co-founder, but merely as our lead formulator. She would casually wave a manicured on-sell, jewel-encrusted hand in my direction, smiling thinly, as if I were just a highly functional, but ultimately disposable, piece of laboratory equipment. Chloe was deeply, pathologically obsessed with the modern concept of high-vibrational living, a trendy, meaningless phrase she constantly weaponized to justify her grotesque corporate spending habits, while simultaneously looking down on everyone else. If a hardworking intern brought her the wrong brand of artisan, imported spring water, she wouldn't just politely correct them. She would publicly humiliate them, delivering a cold lecture on how their low-class, wage-slave mentality was the exact reason they would never achieve true greatness. She aggressively demanded the company lease a sprawling, glass-walled penthouse office space in Beverly Hills that we absolutely could not afford, fiercely arguing that money universally flows to where luxury lives. I watched, completely silent and perfectly still, as she recklessly drained our initial seed funding on superficial aesthetics. She ordered custom Italian marble desks and imported hand-woven silk drapery for her personal, oversized office. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my sterile lab, meticulously budgeting the complex operational costs of our raw ingredient suppliers down to the very last decimal point to ensure our profit margins survived. The contrast between us was stark, bordering on the absurd. I knew the actual, granular cost of the rare botanical extracts she was planning to sell for $150 an ounce. I fully understood the painstaking, back-breaking agricultural labor required to harvest those specific ingredients. She knew absolutely nothing but the retail markup and the aesthetic vibe. I began to notice the subtle, telling imperfections in her deeply curated lifestyle. The supposedly exclusive designer bag she constantly flaunted had a slightly misaligned interior stitching pattern, the hallmark of a high-tier, black market replica. Had designer heels, though stamped with a famous logo, scuffed far too easily on the pavement, revealing a cheaper, synthetic lacquer underneath the bright paint. She lived entirely in a fragile world of mirrors and smoke, heavily leveraged on maxed-out credit cards and predatory high-interest personal loans, just to maintain an illusion of extreme, untouchable wealth. She was completely, utterly oblivious to the terrifying fact that she was partnered with someone who actually possessed the very financial gravity she was so desperately faking. She truly thought she was the apex predator in our little corporate ecosystem. She genuinely thought my continuous silence was a sign of weak submission. She critically mistook my quiet, calculating observation for sheer ignorance. She had absolutely no idea that I was simply sitting back, taking detailed mental notes, and letting her happily weave her own executioner's noose with every arrogant decision and every stolen dollar. The weeks leading up to our official brand launch were an absolute masterclass in psychological endurance. As the pressure mounted, Chloe's mask of fake corporate feminism completely dissolved, revealing the toxic, deeply insecure narcissist underneath. She began treating our shared workspace not as a business, but as her own personal, dictatorial fiefdom. The economic reality outside our Beverly Hills office was grim. Everyday Americans were meticulously budgeting just to afford basic utilities and groceries. Yet Chloe was operating with a grotesque, almost delusional sense of financial entitlement. She began bringing her circle of equally vacuous, influencer friends into the laboratory, a highly sensitive, leavened, sterile environment where I was synthesizing delicate peptide chains. They would parade around in heavy perfumes that threatened to contaminate my raw materials, carelessly tapping their acrylic nails on highly calibrated mass spectrometers. When I calmly asked them to respect the sterile protocols, Chloe loudly scoffed in front of her entourage. "Oh, relax. Naomi, don't project your poverty mindset onto us. It's just soap and water," she sneered, her friends erupting into a chorus of sycophantic giggles. "Try to raise your frequency. You're so deeply entrenched in that low-vibrational back-in, wage-slave mentality. It's honestly exhausting to be around." I didn't argue. I simply locked the thermal incubators, sanitized my station, and went back to work. I let her have the stage. I let her feel incredibly, invincibly tall, completely unaware that she was standing on a trapdoor of my own design. The true depths of her betrayal, however, were unveiled exactly 13 days before the launch. I was in the office at 2:00 a.m. I prefer the absolute silence of the night to do my complex logistical modeling. I was auditing our preliminary supply chain invoices when I noticed a glaring, irreconcilable discrepancy in our corporate accounts. Chloe had been the sole signatory on our primary operating account, a concession I allowed specifically to give her enough rope to hang herself. Using a highly encrypted backdoor entry, I had quietly installed into our network servers on day one, a basic precaution in my family's line of business. I bypassed her weak, heavily predictable passwords and accessed her private email server. What I found was a digital trail of pure, unadulterated fraud. She wasn't just aggressively embezzling our meager seed funding to cover the lease on her flashy European SUV and her towering, past-due personal credit card bills. She was actively brokering a massive, 9-figure leveraged buyout of the entire company with a notoriously ruthless private equity firm based out of Manhattan. I sat back in the ergonomic chair, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes, and coldly read through the email chains. Chloe was explicitly pitching the brand and my proprietary hair regrowth formula as her own sole intellectual property. In a thread with the firm's senior acquisition partners, one of the executives specifically asked about the lab technician and whether I posed a legal risk to the patent rights. Chloe's response was typed with terrifying, sociopathic arrogance. "Naomi is a non-issue. She's just a glorified, highly replaceable mixer. A contractor? At best, she has no equity, no legal standing, and zero business acumen. The moment you wire the acquisition funds, I am terminating her contract and tossing her out. She doesn't have the spine or the capital to fight back." A slow, chilling smile crept across my face in the dark, empty office. She was attempting to sell a multi-million-dollar asset that she didn't legally own to a massive financial institution, utilizing a formula fully patented by an anonymous, multi-billion-dollar holding company that I controlled. In the financial sector, this wasn't just a breach of fiduciary duty, this was massive. Multi-count federal wire fraud. I didn't confront her the next morning. I didn't send an angry text. I downloaded the entire server archive, backed it up to a secure, cold storage drive, and silently prepared for the main event. The launch party was a grotesque monument to Chloe's vanity, held at a sprawling, wildly overpriced rooftop venue in West Hollywood. The event was heavily drenched in a manufactured aesthetic of extreme wealth, but because I know exactly how true wealth operates, I could instantly spot the cheap, desperate shortcuts everywhere. The champagne towers were constructed using a high-yield, heavily sulfated sparkling wine masquerading as vintage champagne. The floral arrangements, which she claimed were imported orchids, were cleverly disguised. Mid-tier synthetics mixed with cheap fillers. She had invited the Manhattan private equity executives, the very men she was planning to sell me out to. They stood in the VIP section, wearing sharp, bespoke Italian suits, looking at Chloe like she was a highly profitable, easily manipulated golden goose. I arrived an hour into the event. I was dressed precisely as I always was. A simple, impeccably tailored black dress, completely unbranded, paired with comfortable, sensible flats. I walked quietly past the flashing cameras of the hired local press, heading straight toward the VIP barricade, where Chloe was holding court with the New York investors. The moment she spotted me, her face contorted into a mask of pure, visceral disgust. She didn't just walk over to me. She actively signaled for two heavily built, rented security guards to intercept my path. The music was loud, but the tension instantly shattered the atmosphere around us. "What are you doing here?" Chloe hissed, her voice a venomous, frantic whisper as she physically blocked me from stepping onto the elevated VIP platform. "I'm the co-founder. Clue. This is my product launch," I replied, my voice steady, cold and entirely devoid of emotion. I looked directly into her eyes, watching the panicked desperation flare in her pupils. "You are nothing," she spat, raising her voice just enough so the surrounding influencers and the New York executives could hear her. She was performing. She needed to assert her dominance in front of her buyers. "You are a replaceable, pathetic little mixer who doesn't understand the first thing about building an empire. You're a liability to my brand." The room grew agonizingly quiet. The pulsing bass of the DJ booth seemed to fade into the background as dozens of pairs of eyes turned to watch the execution. Chloe took a step closer, pointing a flawlessly manicured finger sharply into my chest. "You don't belong here, Naomi. You don't belong in this tax bracket. You don't belong in this industry. And you certainly don't belong in my company. You're fired, effective immediately. Now get your cheap, unpolished shoes off my red carpet before I have security physically throw you into the street like the trash you are." A collective, audible gasp rippled through the crowd. The New York executives watched with mild, detached amusement, sipping their cheap, sulfated wine. They thought they were witnessing the brutal, necessary trimming of corporate dead weight. I looked at the security guards, who were nervously gripping their radios, waiting for my reaction. I looked at the investors, mentally calculating the exact amount of millions they were about to lose. And finally, I looked back at Chloe. Her chest was heaving. She was trembling with the adrenaline of her own perceived power, waiting for me to shatter, to cry, to beg for my job in front of the entire Los Angeles beauty elite. I gave her absolutely nothing. I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't raise my voice by a single decibel. I simply tilted my head, analyzing her like a fascinating, deeply flawed organism under a microscope. "Make sure you save your receipts, Chloe," I whispered, the words carrying a glacial, terrifying weight that only she could hear. "You are going to need every single one of them." Without waiting for a response, I turned on my heel and walked out. I didn't rush. I walked with the slow, measured, heavy cadence of an executioner leaving the gallows. As I stepped into the cool, chaotic night air of the Los Angeles streets, I pulled my phone from my pocket. I bypassed my usual apps and opened a heavily encrypted, direct satellite line to my family's chief financial officer in Geneva. The time for observation was officially over. It was time to systematically, ruthlessly tear her world apart. Brick, pistolen, brick. The drive from the suffocating, Synthetic glitz of West Hollywood to my actual sanctuary took exactly 47 minutes. Chloe firmly believed I lived in a cramped, mold-susceptible studio apartment in a decaying part of the valley. Because that is the address I officially put on our corporate formation documents. In reality, I pulled my unassuming sedan up to a heavily fortified, brutally minimalist concrete and glass property, tucked deep into the private, gated hills of Bel Air, a property held entirely under a nameless, untouchable trust. I bypassed the biometric security scanners and walked directly down to the subterranean level of the estate. This wasn't a living space. It was a state-of-the-art, climate-controlled server room and command center. The air down here was frigid, humming with the low, steady vibration of enterprise-grade mainframes. This was my true element. No fake champagne, no rented security guards, just the pure, unadulterated, mathematical reality of global finance. I sat down at the massive, multi-monitor workstation and pulled up the secure satellite connection to Geneva. My family's chief financial officer, a fiercely intelligent, ruthlessly efficient man named Elias, answered on the first ring. "Naomi," Elias said, his voice a calm, gravelly baritone. "It is 3 in the morning in Los Angeles. I assume the launch party did not go according to the traditional blueprint." "You could say that," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "She fired me in front of the Manhattan private equity buyers. She is moving forward with the fraudulent intellectual property transfer." I heard the subtle, sharp sound of Elias setting his heavy fountain pen down on his mahogany desk thousands of miles away. "I see. And what are your precise instructions?" "I want a forensic, microscopic audit of her entire existence. Elias, I want our financial analyst to tear through the firewall of her life, trace every shell corporation, every offshore holding, every line of unsecured credit, and every hidden liability. I want to know what she spends on her morning coffee, and I want to know exactly who currently holds the paper on her fraudulent debts. Leave absolutely no stone unturned. Consider her financially dissected," Elias replied, the faint clicking of his keyboard already echoing through the encrypted line. "Give me 20 minutes. While I waited, I didn't pace. I didn't seethe with anger or cry over the public humiliation I had just endured. Anger is a remarkably useless, highly inefficient emotion. It clouds judgment and leads to sloppy, premature execution. Instead, I poured myself a glass of room-temperature distilled water, sat back in my ergonomic chair, and waited for the raw data to arrive. When the encrypted file finally dropped into my secure server, I opened it and let the glowing screens wash over me. What I found was a masterpiece of financial rot. A forensic audit is like performing a psychological autopsy on the living. Numbers never lie. They strip away the designer clothing, the curated social media filters, and the loud, arrogant posturing, revealing the naked, terrified truth underneath. And Chloe's truth was deeply, pathetically terrifying. The economic reality of the United States was currently punishing anyone living beyond their means. Interest rates were historically brutal, designed to choke out reckless spending. Yet Chloe had somehow convinced herself that she was immune to macroeconomic gravity. The initial layer of the audit revealed her personal catastrophe, that sprawling, glass-walled Beverly Hills penthouse she constantly bragged about owning. It was an illegal sublease, heavily leveraged under a ghost LLC, and she was currently 3 months delinquent on rent. Her Pristine, top-of-the-line European SUV, was strapped with a predatory SUV, variable-rate auto loan that was mathematically guaranteed to default within the next 60 days. Her credit profile was a disaster zone of kiting. She was taking out high-interest cash advances on secondary credit cards simply to make the minimum monthly payments on her primary, maxed-out black cards. She was drowning in unsecured liabilities, completely suffocated by the exorbitant cost of maintaining her fake rich aesthetic. But the personal debt was just the appetizer. The main course was the corporate treason. As I dug deeper into the flow of our seed funding, the true extent of her sociopathy crystallized on my monitors. I tracked the outbound wire transfers from our primary operating account. She had set up a fake consulting firm, registered to a post office box in Delaware. Over the past 8 months, she had been systematically siphoning tens of thousands of dollars of our investors' money under the guise of brand architectural fees, funneling it directly into her personal accounts to pay for her imported silk drapery, her counterfeit designer bags, and her fraudulent lifestyle. She was a walking, breathing federal crime. She wasn't just arrogant, she was desperately war-nosed, dangerously cornered. And cornered animals make catastrophic miscalculations. The final puzzle piece was the term sheet from the Manhattan private equity firm, the men in the cheap Italian suits from the party. I hacked into the secure data room where they were sharing legal documents. The firm had presented Chloe with a multi-million-dollar acquisition offer, but it came with a massive, ironclad due diligence contingency. To prove that the hair regrowth brand was scalable and that the formula was stable, they required Chloe to manufacture, package, and successfully deliver an initial retail run of exactly 100,000 units within the next 30 days. If she failed to hit that production quota, the entire 9-figure deal would instantly implode, and they would legally walk away. I stared at the glowing numbers, a cold, predatory smile finally touching the corners of my mouth. To manufacture 100,000 units of my proprietary formula, Chloe needed the raw, active botanical ingredients. Specifically, she needed a highly volatile, exceptionally rare biopeptide extract that was the very heartbeat of the product's efficacy. She believed she could simply order this extract from the wholesale chemical distributor we had been using for our prototypes. What her shallow, purely aesthetic mind completely failed to comprehend was the intricate, invisible web of the global supply chain. She didn't know that the wholesale distributor was just a front-facing subsidiary. She didn't know that the manufacturing plant that synthesized the extract was owned by a holding company in Singapore. And she certainly didn't know that the Singaporean holding company was a direct, wholly owned asset of my family's conglomerate. I literally owned the soil the ingredients grew in, the laboratories that refined them, and the ships that transported them. I was the architect of the very air she was breathing. Chloe had mocked me for being a wage slave. She had publicly humiliated me, calling me low-vibrational and replaceable trash because I didn't flaunt fake wealth or wear logos. She was about to learn a very painful, irreversible lesson about the distinct difference between looking rich and wielding absolute terrifying power. I picked up the secure line to Geneva once more. "Elias," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the cold server room. "I have reviewed the data. It is time to initiate Phase 1. "Understood," Elias replied. "Shall I begin purchasing her unsecured debt?" "Yes," I instructed softly. "I want my holding company to aggressively buy out every single one of her private loans, her credit lines, and the mezzanine debt on her corporate leases. Pay a premium if you have to. I don't want her owing a single dime to anyone else on this planet. And the supply chain, choke it," I said, the finality of the word hanging heavily in the frigid air. "Flag the biopeptide extract she needs for the private equity run. Institut à Total. Global embargo on her corporate entity. Cite severe, unforeseen geopolitical supply chain delays. Raise the cost of all secondary raw materials by 400%. Consider it done. Naomi, she will be economically paralyzed by sunrise." I hung up the phone and leaned back, watching the digital sun begin to rise on my monitors. I wasn't going to sue her. Not yet. A lawsuit would be too quick, too merciful. No, I was going to quietly become her absolute master. I was going to cut off her oxygen supply, sit back in the shadows, and watch her slowly suffocate on her own toxic ambition. The silent squeeze had officially begun. For the first 48 hours after the launch party, I did absolutely nothing but sit in the heavily air-conditioned silence of my Bel Air command center and watch the digital metrics of Chloe's life begin to flatline. There is a profound, deeply satisfying poetry in the slow destruction of an arrogant person. When you truly hold the levers of macroeconomic power, you do not need to scream, you do not need to throw public tantrums, and you certainly do not need to seek validation from the internet. You simply close the valve, sit back in the shadows, and watched the vacuum of space do its terrifying work. By Tuesday morning, Elias had successfully executed the debt acquisition protocol. Through a labyrinth of shell corporations and aggressive buyout offers, my holding company had legally purchased every single ounce of Chloe's toxic, high-yield debt. I now owned the predatory auto loan on her leased luxury European SUV. I owned the mezzanine debt financing her fraudulent Beverly Hills office space. I even owned the severely delinquent commercial credit lines she had maxed out to purchase her fake imported silk drapery. She was no longer indebted to faceless banking institutions. She was, mathematically and legally, my absolute indentured servant. And she didn't even know it yet. The true panic, however, began to set in when she finally attempted to move forward with the private equity firm's impossible manufacturing quota. Sitting at my multi-monitor workstation, I watched the live feed of our primary corporate supply chain portal. At exactly 10:14 a.m., Chloe's IP address logged into the wholesale chemical distributor's interface. She aggressively submitted an expedited, Tier 1 purchase order for 500 liters of the proprietary active biopeptide extract, the exact required volume to synthesize the 100,000 retail units demanded by her Manhattan investors. She confidently hit submit. My finger rested gently on the enter key of my own terminal. I tapped it once, on Chloe's end. The screen immediately flashed a fatal, glaring red error message. Error code 404. Account suspended. Global supply chain embargo. Fulfillment impossible. I had my corporate espionage software running a silent mirror on her desktop. I watched her cursor frantically dart across the screen as she clicked submit again, and again, and again. When the digital portal refused to bend to her delusional will, she did exactly what entitled people always do. She picked up the phone and demanded to speak to a manager. She dialed the primary fulfillment director of the wholesale distribution center, a man named Marcus, who, unbeknownst to her, drew his six-figure salary directly from my family's payroll. I listened to the recorded audio file of the call 10 minutes later. Listen to me, Marcus. Chloe's voice shrieked through the receiver, the manicured veneer of the girl boss completely shattering. I don't care about your alleged global logistical issues. I am your biggest account. I am a visionary brand architect, and I have a 9-figure acquisition on the line. You are going to bypass this embargo. You are going to put my extract on a private cargo plane, and you are going to deliver it to my facility by Friday, or I will personally see to it that you are fired. Marcus, well briefed on the protocol, responded with the cold, deadpan apathy of corporate bureaucracy. I apologize, Mom. Due to unprecedented macroeconomic tightening and geopolitical instability in our primary botanical agricultural zones, the specific lipid peptide chain you require is completely frozen. Furthermore, due to severe inflationary pressures, the cost of all your secondary stabilizing agents, the emulsifiers, the synthetic preservatives, the packaging resins has been adjusted. The new wholesale price is 400% higher than your previous invoice. We require immediate, upfront payment via wire transfer. Net. 30 credit terms have been revoked. I heard the sharp, sudden intake of breath on Chloe's end of the line. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the terrifying realization of her own immediate mortality. Without the extract, there was no product. Without the product, the private equity deal was entirely dead. And without that 9-figure buyout, she was going to face total, catastrophic bankruptcy. You can't do this, she whispered, her voice finally breaking. I have investors, have a highly productive, high-vibrational day. Mom, Marcus replied smoothly, before terminating the connection. Over the next 2 weeks, I systematically tightened the invisible noose. The financial squeeze began to aggressively manifest in her physical reality. It started at a hyper-exclusive, obnoxiously overpriced organic matcha cafe in West Hollywood. Chloe was desperately trying to maintain her public facade, attempting to recruit a mid-tier lifestyle influencer to post about the brand. When the barista handed her the bill for a $45 round of synthetic lattes, Chloe confidently handed over her platinum corporate card. I was watching my banking alerts. I manually declined the transaction, Insufficient funds. She nervously laughed it off, blaming a clerical error at her wealth management firm, and pulled out her personal gold card. Declined. Account frozen. She tried a third card. A high APR secondary line of credit. Declined. Delinquent status. She was forced to endure the agonizing, deeply humiliating experience of having the influencer pay for the check, all while the barista stared at her with barely concealed, classist judgment. But the absolute climax of her public destruction occurred exactly 10 minutes later when she walked out to the valet stand. Her leased, top-of-the-line European SUV was currently hooked up to the heavy steel chains of a heavy-duty commercial tow truck. I had authorized the repossession the night before, because I now owned the debt. I legally bypassed the standard 90-day grace period, citing an extreme, verifiable risk of asset depreciation. Chloe completely lost her mind. Right there on the sun-baked pavement of Melrose Avenue, in front of the influencer she was trying to impress, her carefully curated high-vibrational persona violently evaporated. She lunged at the tow truck driver, a burly, deeply unbothered man chewing a toothpick, screaming obscenities, desperately slapping her manicured hands against the tinted windows of the vehicle. "You can't take this. I am a CEO. Do you know who I am? I have a 9-figure valuation. This is illegal." She shrieked, her expensive, toxic perfume failing to mask the scent of pure, unadulterated desperation. "Call your bank, lady," the driver grunted indifferently, securing the final axle strap. "Paperwork says you're 90 days past due. Car belongs to the holding company now." She stood on the sidewalk, entirely abandoned, hyperventilating, as she watched her primary symbol of manufactured wealth disappear into the Los Angeles traffic. When she finally made it back to her glass-walled office in Beverly Hills via a heavily surged rideshare that she had to put on a prepaid debit card, the environment was toxic. Her unpaid interns, the very people she had constantly abused and mocked for their wage-slave mentalities, had finally walked out. The phones were ringing incessantly. Her superficial friends had completely abandoned her the moment she couldn't foot the bill for their lavish dinners. She was entirely alone in her custom-designed, Italian marble tomb. And then, the final, devastating blow landed. A priority email hit her inbox from the senior acquisition partner at the Manhattan private equity firm, Chloe. "We have noted a complete lack of verifiable supply chain movement regarding the 100 NOS 000 unit production quota. If we do not receive physical, audited proof of the manufacturing run within 72 hours, we are pulling the term sheet, executing the penalty clause, and moving on to other viable assets. Furthermore, our legal department requires the final registered trademark and patent documents explicitly in your name before we release the escrow funds." I watched her face through her laptop camera. Her eyes were bloodshot, her makeup smeared. She was staring at the abyss of federal prison for embezzlement, complete public humiliation, and crushing poverty. She had absolutely no way out through legitimate business channels. She couldn't manufacture the product. She couldn't secure a loan. She was completely financially paralyzed. And that is exactly when the desperation forced her to take the final, fatal bet. If she couldn't sell them the physical product, her deeply flawed, arrogant logic dictated that she had to sell them the pure intellectual property before they discovered the supply chain was dead. But to do that, she needed to legally prove she owned it. I watched her open a blank legal document on her screen. I watched her begin to falsify the United States Patent and Trademark Office application, aggressively typing her own name over my proprietary formula, fully intending to commit multi-million-dollar federal perjury just to secure the buyout funds. She thought she was being brilliant. She thought she was surviving. She had absolutely no idea she had just locked the cage from the inside and handed me the only key. There is a specific, deeply predictable psychology to a cornered narcissist. When you strip away their audience, their credit lines, and their manufactured status symbols, they do not self-reflect. They do not suddenly find humility or seek redemption. Instead, their ego goes into a state of feral, catastrophic hyperdrive. They will lie, cheat, and destroy anything in their path just to maintain the illusion for one more day. Sitting in the absolute, temperature-controlled silence of my Bel Air server room, I monitored Chloe's erratic digital footprint as she stared down the barrel of the private equity firm's 72-hour ultimatum. She was completely boxed in. She couldn't manufacture the physical product because I had aggressively embargoed the raw biopeptides. She couldn't secure bridge financing because I secretly owned all of her toxic debt. Her only theoretical exit strategy was to sell the intellectual property itself before the Manhattan executives realized the supply chain was entirely dead. But to sell the IP, she needed legally binding documentation, proving she was the sole creator and owner of the formula. I knew she would try to steal it. In fact, I was counting on it. But to make sure she walked perfectly into the center of the trap without hesitation, I had to lay out a trail of breadcrumbs so intoxicatingly easy. Her arrogant, superficial mind couldn't possibly resist. Through my encrypted terminal, I accessed the public-facing database of the United States Patent and Trademark Office, USPTO. 10 years ago, my family's holding company had filed an ironclad, deeply buried master patent for the foundational lipid peptide structure of the formula. However, during our initial partnership, I had intentionally filed a highly visible, completely useless, provisional patent application under my own legal name, Naomi, just to keep up appearances for Chloe. With a few keystrokes, I manipulated the status of that useless provisional application. I intentionally let it reflect that the required maintenance fees had bounced due to insufficient funds, causing the application to appear legally lapsed and officially abandoned. I watched through her webcam as she frantically scoured the USPTO database. When she saw the abandoned status on my provisional patent, a sickening, triumphant smile stretched across her haggard face. In her aggressively classist mind, this made perfect sense. Of course, the low-vibrational, wage-slave lab technician couldn't afford the federal filing fees. Of course, I was too poor and disorganized to protect my own life's work. She took the bait with the desperate greed of a starving animal. Over the next 4 hours, I watched in high definition as she meticulously committed multi-million-dollar federal perjury. She downloaded the official USPTO intellectual property assignment forms. Her hands were visibly shaking as she typed her own legal name into the box designated for the sole lead inventor. She blatantly falsified the clinical trial dates, falsely claiming she had synthesized the chemical compounds in her own kitchen years ago. She checked the box confirming that all statements were made under the strict penalty of federal perjury, wire fraud, and severe financial restitution. She hit print. She signed the documents with a heavy, dramatic flourish of blue ink. She genuinely believed she had just outsmarted me. She thought she had just successfully stolen my life's work and secured her 9-figure payout. The closing meeting with the private equity firm was scheduled for 2:00 p.m. the following afternoon at a rented DOZ, high-security boardroom in Century City. Chloe's arrival was a masterclass in tragic comedy. Because I had successfully repossessed her luxury SUV, and her credit cards were completely frozen. She had been forced to pawn her last remaining authentic piece of jewelry just to rent a mid-tier black car service for the afternoon. Desperately trying to keep up the facade of the successful CEO for the New York buyers, I was not physically in the boardroom, but I didn't need to be. I had complete audio and visual access through the heavily compromised microphone on Chloe's laptop, which she had opened on the mahogany conference table to display her fraudulent presentation. "Gentlemen," Chloe said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet, manufactured confidence that barely masked her underlying hyperventilation. "As requested, I have brought the finalized, legally notarized USPTO patent assignments, fully registered under my name. The intellectual property is entirely secure, free of any encumbrances from former, disgruntled contractors." "Excellent," replied the senior acquisition partner, a man whose voice possessed the dry, ruthless cadence of corporate Manhattan. I listened to the heavy, expensive rustle of paper as he reviewed her forged documents. "The indemnification clauses are standard. You are legally certifying that you are the sole creator, and you hold all global rights to the biopeptide complex, correct?" "Absolutely," Chloe beamed, practically vibrating out of her tailored suit. "It is my life's work. 100% my vision. Very well. If you sign the definitive acquisition agreement right here on page 42, the intellectual property legally transfers to our holding company, and we will authorize the immediate release of the first $25 million from escrow. The scratching sound of her expensive fountain pen hitting the heavy stock paper echoed clearly through my headset. She signed her name. She signed her life away. She legally bound herself to a massive, multi-million-dollar federal fraud, explicitly tying her signature to stolen property. The ink was barely dry. The private equity executives were just beginning to reach for the celebratory bottles of sparkling water on the table. Chloe was letting out a long, shuddering breath, believing she had finally escaped her crumbling reality. She was exactly 3 seconds into her fantasy when the heavy, frosted glass doors of the boardroom violently swung open. They did not knock. They did not wait for an invitation. Walking into the room were 3 of the most terrifyingly expensive, impeccably dressed corporate litigators on the West Coast. They were the apex predators of my family's legal division, men and women who specialized in the absolute, total financial annihilation of hostile corporate entities. They moved with the cold, synchronized precision of a military strike team. Chloe's triumphant smile instantly collapsed. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking hollow and deeply sick. "Excuse me," she stammered, her voice cracking violently. "This is a closed, private acquisition meeting. Who are you?" The lead litigator, a tall, piercingly calm woman named Sarah, did not even acknowledge Chloe's outrage. She simply walked straight to the center of the mahogany table and dropped a heavy, meticulously bound stack of legal documents directly on top of Chloe's freshly signed, fraudulent contract. The heavy thud of the paper sounded like a coffin slamming shut. "Clue," Sarah said, her voice echoing with chilling, absolute authority. "You are hereby served with an emergency federal injunction, an immediate asset freeze, and a civil subpoena on behalf of our client, the primary shareholder of the global botanical supply chain conglomerate." The Manhattan private equity executives instantly froze, their corporate survival instincts violently kicking in. "What is the meaning of this?" the senior partner demanded, stepping away from Chloe, as if she were suddenly radioactive. "Who is your client?" Sarah didn't look at the executives. She kept her dead, predatory gaze entirely locked on Chloe, watching the absolute, unadulterated terror shatter the fake rich facade once and for all. "Our client," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm, "is the woman you publicly fired on a red carpet last week, and she would like her company back." The heavy, frosted glass doors of the boardroom were just the prologue. That devastating ambush in Century City triggered an emergency, high-stakes legal cascade that dragged us directly into the sterile, fluorescent lit Los Angeles Superior Court. Which brings us exactly back to where this story began. Part 1. Sitting across from me was Chloe, wrapped in that violently magenta-tailored suit. Despite the catastrophic ambush at the private equity meeting, she was still aggressively clinging to a deeply delusional sliver of hope. She was smirking because her high-priced, heavily compensated defense attorney genuinely believed they had found a legal loophole. They had discovered my abandoned provisional patent, the useless decoy I had intentionally let lapse, and they were banking their entire defense on the arrogant assumption that it was the only piece of intellectual property documentation I possessed. "Your Honor," Chloe's attorney boomed, his voice dripping with the theatrical, manufactured outrage of a man billing $1,000 an hour. He waved a printed copy of my lapsed provisional patent in the air. "This emergency injunction is completely baseless. The plaintiff, a disgruntled former contractor, abandoned her provisional patent application over a year ago due to an inability to pay basic federal filing fees. My client, the visionary CEO of this brand, properly filed and registered the formula. The plaintiff has zero legal standing, zero equity, and absolutely no proof of ownership. We respectfully request an immediate dismissal and sanctions for this frivolous harassment." Chloe leaned back in her heavy leather chair. She crossed her legs, looking directly at me with that familiar, sickeningly condescending upward tilt of her mouth. She genuinely thought she had checkmated me. She thought her expensive lawyer had just publicly exposed me as a fraud. I didn't blink. I didn't show a single fraction of an emotion. I simply looked at Sarah, my lead corporate litigator, and gave her a nearly imperceptible nod. Your Honor, Sarah said, her voice cutting through the courtroom with the cold, absolute precision of a surgical scalpel. She didn't raise her voice. True power never has to shout. Defense counsel is entirely correct that the provisional application filed under the plaintiff's personal name was allowed to lapse. However, that application was merely a secondary, localized filing. Sarah stepped forward, holding a pristine, heavy, leather-bound folio. She handed it directly to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. What you hold in your hands, Your Honor, is the master patent, Sarah continued, the courtroom falling into a suffocating dead silence. Filed exactly 10 years ago, with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and simultaneously registered under the strict international protocols of the Geneva Convention, it explicitly outlines the exact proprietary lipid peptide extraction method, the exact molecular compound, and the precise stabilization matrix of the formula in question. The judge pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, his eyes scanning the heavy, watermarked federal document. This master patent is registered to a global holding company, a multinational botanical supply chain conglomerate, the judge noted, looking down at Sarah with a raised eyebrow. Counsel, how does this relate to your client? I finally stood up. I smoothed the front of my simple unbranded black sweater. I looked past the judge, past the stunned gallery, and locked my eyes entirely on Chloe. It relates to me. Your Honor, I said, my voice echoing off the high wood-paneled walls, smooth and violently calm, because I am the sole heir, the primary shareholder, and the absolute controlling entity of that exact conglomerate. I am the holding company. I watched the exact millisecond the absolute, catastrophic reality crashed into Chloe's brain. The arrogant smirk didn't just fade. It violently shattered, replaced by a hollow, terrifying realization. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her magenta suit, looking like a garish joke against her ghost-white skin. Furthermore, Your Honor, Sarah interjected, twisting the invisible knife with flawless legal execution, my client does not just own the intellectual property. Through a series of legal debt acquisitions over the past 3 weeks, my client's holding company is also the sole proprietor of the defense's corporate mezzanine debt, the lease on her commercial office space, and every single one of her unsecured personal credit lines. We have also submitted definitive proof to the court that the defendant committed multi-million-dollar federal perjury by falsifying IP assignments to secure a private equity buyout for an asset she mathematically and legally never owned. Chloe's high-priced attorney physically stepped away from her, his face turning an ashen gray. In the legal world, representing a client who has just been conclusively exposed for committing federal wire fraud and perjury during an active acquisition is a career-ending radioactive event. You, Chloe stammered, her voice a fragile, broken whisper. She gripped the edge of the defense table so hard, her acrylic nails threatened to snap. The supply chain embargo. The price hikes. The tow truck. Yes, Chloe, I replied, my voice dropping to a chilling, intimate register, ensuring she heard every single syllable. I own the farms. I own the laboratories. I own the distribution hubs. I own the paper on your repossessed car. And I own the debt you used to buy your fake silk drapery. You spent a year calling me a wage slave, humiliating me for my wardrobe, and mocking my financial status. You were so deeply obsessed with the shallow illusion of wealth that you completely failed to recognize the absolute, terrifying gravity of true power standing right next to you. The judge didn't even need to recess to deliberate. He immediately granted our summary judgment, enforcing the complete asset freeze, and officially transferring everything back to my control. But the civil victory was just the beginning of her nightmare. Sitting in the gallery's back row were the furious, deeply vindictive attorneys for the Manhattan private equity firm. The moment the judge banged his gavel, they aggressively cornered Chloe. Because she had legally signed that fraudulent contract in the Century City boardroom, she had actively attempted to defraud a major financial institution. They immediately filed a massive cross-claim against her. triggering a federal criminal investigation for embezzlement and grand larceny. Chloe collapsed back into her chair. The manicured, high-vibrational girl boss was entirely gone. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders violently shaking as she broke down into loud, ugly, uncontrollable sobs in front of the entire court. She had absolutely nothing. Her fake designer life had been repossessed. Her reputation was internationally destroyed. And she was looking at a very real, very lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary. I didn't stay to watch her cry. Pity is a luxury reserved for those who simply make honest mistakes. Chloe had made calculated, malicious choices. I turned my back on her weeping frame, walked calmly out of the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, and stepped back out into the bright, blinding Los Angeles sun, entirely untouchable. True power doesn't need to scream. True power doesn't need a designer logo, a leased luxury car, or the validation of strangers on the internet. True power operates in the absolute silence of the shadows, patiently waiting for the arrogant and the cruel to blindly walk into a trap of their own making. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you found Chloe's absolute, mathematical destruction as deeply satisfying as I did, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment down below telling me what you would have done in my shoes. And make sure you turn on those notification bells so you never miss another story of absolute, brutal karma. Until next time, stay smart, stay silent, and never underestimate the quiet ones. Goodbye for now.